go into your OR, walk through, play around on the machine, get to know where your equipment is, look at the equipment. If it's different than what you're used to, just have a good idea of your equipment is really what it comes down to. And I mean, that's really anywhere you go. Even as a CRNA, like you need to have a good idea of your equipment, know your equipment. If you're not familiar with it, go in early and get familiar with it before you start having to have patients in the room and you're trying to take care of patients and you need something, you don't know where it is, and you kind of see how that can snowball.
Hello, future CRNA. Welcome to CRNA School Prep Academy podcast. I have a very special episode lined up for you today, and it is part of our guest host series where I am bringing current SRNAs on the show for you as a guest host on the CSPA podcast. And my thought process behind doing this is I wanted you to hear from current students, a variety of current students who are at different stages of their CRNA journey, and really allow you to kind of step into their world and hear them talk about what it's like to be a current student dealing with things like difficult preceptors or different anesthesia topics, clinical topics, maybe even things like time management, stress management, things like that. I think these episodes are going to be gold, and I hope you enjoy as much as I always do hearing from current students. I know for a fact that the reason why CRNA School Prep Academy is where it is today, and the reason why I have learned so much is from diving all in, listening to current students along with CRNAs share a wealth of information and really kind of taking all of that information and kind of compiling it into kind of the system that we have created today. And I know that you're doing the same thing by tuning into the show week after week, developing your own method, your own strategy, and your own system for success. So I hope you enjoy these guest episodes. Let's go ahead and get into today's show.
Welcome to the CRNA School Prep Academy podcast. I am your guest host, David Warren, and today we are talking about what I wish I had known prior to starting CRNA school in the clinical portion. Think of this as part one. Part two is going to cover what I wish I had known prior to CRNA school in the didactic portion. But I just started clinical recently, and this is all very fresh on my mind, and I wanted to share the content with you while it is still fresh on my mind. For those of you who don't know me as a guest host, my background is in emergency medicine as a nurse practitioner for about 8 years. That is a whole topic within itself that we will cover at some point in time, but not today. My goal with creating content here is to really bring you valuable insight into what is going on in the life of a nurse anesthesia resident and someone who's in CRNA school. So today we're diving right into what I wish I had known prior to CRNA school in the clinical portion. So to give you a little background, I am in a front-loaded DNAP program out on the West Coast, and I started in January of 2022, and I finished my didactic portion in March of 2023 at the end of March, and I started clinical in April of 2023, so just like 3 or 4 months ago. And I finished my first clinical rotation. I just started my second clinical rotation. And I really want to dive deep in today on some of the things that I wish I had known. What do I wish I had known prior to starting this clinical journey? Because I did one of these videos on my YouTube channel a few months ago about what I wish I had known prior to CRNA school in the didactic portion. And now that I'm starting clinicals, some of those things or some of the things that I wish I had known are starting to arise. And I really want to share that information with you. I hope that you find it helpful. I hope that you find it insightful. And if you are a current nurse anesthesia resident, you're probably resonating with a lot of this, because I feel like a lot of people that I've talked to, a lot of my colleagues in the field who are nurse anesthesia residents feel the same way. So I have some points listed here. I'm just going to go in order, and this is no particular order of importance, but these are just things that I wish I had known prior to starting my clinical journey. The first is really know your school and know your sites. Know your school and know your sites. And what I mean by that is, in my program out on the West Coast, I knew when I applied that I was going to have to be traveling for clinical, that all of my clinical, wasn't going to be in one state. I was going to have to go to multiple states across a year and a half time span to get all of my rotations in. And that was made very clear up front during my interview, and I was okay with that. However, whenever you're applying to CRNA school, if you're thinking about applying to school, or if you're already in school, you're kind of stuck there now, but know like what your clinical rotations are going to look like. Are you going to be in one state at like an academic medical center, one hospital the whole time? Or are you going to be going to different places? So at my last clinical rotation, some of the CRNAs I worked with had a mix of training. Some of them did all of their training in one like academic medical center, and some of them floated all over and went all over the place like I do now. And that's just going to be school specific. And so just know going into your clinical training or going into your application to CRNA school, what you're going to be doing. Are you going to be staying in one area, or are you going to be floating around to like multiple different states? And the second part of that is know the sites that you are going to be going to and kind of how those sites are run. And what I mean by that is, are they CRNA only sites? Are they medical direction sites? Are they supervision sites? If it's a medical direction or supervision site, do the physician anesthesiologist push your induction drugs for you? Do you get to do your own regional? All of those questions come about when you start talking about different sites and how different sites are run. And that's something that you can bring up and ask in your interview. You can ask, where are the clinical sites? What kind of practice environment do the clinical sites offer? So the school that I'm at, over 90% of our clinical sites are CRNA only sites or independent sites. And we do have some supervised ACT sites, but they are very loosely supervised, meaning that the physician anesthesiologist is not in the room on induction, usually not pushing your drugs for you. You're doing everything. You're doing your own regional. And again, that's very, when we say supervision or medical direction, that's very facility dependent as to what that actually means and what that actually looks like, if that makes sense. So know going in where you're going to have to go for clinical. If you're going to have to go to multiple states, you're going to stay in one state, you're staying at one medical center. If you're going to be traveling around, maybe within that state, all good questions to ask going forward, because that may not fit with your schedule. I mean, maybe you want to be in a school where you're doing all of your rotations at one site and you don't have to move. There are certainly advantages to that. You're not spending, thousands of dollars a month packing everything up, moving to an Airbnb and doing that 12 weeks in and 12 weeks out. So the disadvantage to that is you're getting all of your training in one area, and maybe in all these different areas, they do things differently. And you can kind of get a feel for what you like, what you don't like, what works well, what doesn't work well. There are advantages and disadvantages to both. And you can be successful doing either, honestly. There are CRNA programs that offer both of those extremes, and people graduate and are successful CRNAs. So it's not going to hinder you, but you just have to look at the pros and cons and weigh, is that something you want to do or not, based on whether you want to travel or you want to stay local where your school is. And then the different sites, the different types of sites, whether it's like a supervision or an independent practice, I would definitely encourage you to try to get those independent sites if you can, just because I'm at an independent site right now, the CRNA only site, and it is just very different. The whole vibe, the feel is very different than my last site, which was a supervision site. And so just try to get that experience if you can, because it's super interesting to see CRNA only practices and how they work and how they run and how things are done. It's a great environment. And I would highly encourage you, if you have the opportunity to do a rotation, if you have like an elective opportunity, or if your school sends you to CRNA only sites, like some schools do. So yeah, I would ask in your interview. That's certainly a good question to ask. Where are your sites at, and what's kind of the culture in that site? Are you at supervised? Are you in an independent site? Things like that. So historically, people more towards the West Coast and the Midwest are going to be independent, or they're going to have independent sites. Things over on the East Coast are going to be heavily restricted. And that's just a pattern. There's not to say that there aren't independent sites on the East Coast. They're just fewer when compared with other parts of the United States. So that's definitely something I wish I had known, because it's worked out well for me so far, because I knew going in I was gonna have to travel. Like, that was a given. And I also knew that most of the sites were independent. But now that I'm at an independent site, I'm like, this is really cool. Like, I would love more of this. And so looking back, like, had I gotten into CRNA school at a place that didn't have independent sites, like, that would definitely be a thing now that I'm like, I really wish I had that. So just use that as an opportunity to ask questions in your interview, where your clinical sites are, what's the culture at that particular site. Okay, the second point, we're kind of jumping all over here. The second point is the equipment you train on in your simulation lab or at your school is going to be different than the equipment you use in the real OR. And that took me a little bit of getting used to, because I remember my first day in we'll start with simulation lab. I remember my first day in the simulation lab seeing this like, 90s model, 80s model anesthesia machine. And I'm like, that's cool. Like, I have no idea how that works. But, over the course of a year and a half, we learned everything about the anesthesia machine. Basically, all the parts. I feel like an engineer. You have to know all the parts of it. What, the high pressure system, the intermediate pressure system, the low pressure system, what the vaporizers are, what the APL valve is. There's all these things that you have to know. And I will say this, that most of the anesthesia machines out there have the same or similar functionality, a lot of the same functionality, but there are differences in those anesthesia machines, especially the ones that you train on. Because when I trained on, like I said, was very, and not antique, but it was digital, but it was just different. It was an earlier model than what people use in the OR nowadays. And so having to get used to that equipment change was quite challenging for me, honestly. So that first day in simulation lab, like I said, when I saw the anesthesia machine, I was like, oh, that looks like a new machine, because I'd never seen a machine at the time. And then spending a year and a half with that machine and learning the odds and ends of it, I feel like I was good in the simulation lab. And then when I went to clinical my first day, I was kind of taken aback, because I was like, what is this? There was an anesthesia machine there, and it had like basically a big iPad screen there in the middle of it, which a lot of them do now. A lot of the newer machines have the iPad looking touch screen there where you can change things. And so that's something that when I first got in the OR, I was like, oh, that it's different. Like, it's not what I'm used to, because the ventilator waveform on my machine was about this big, and the ventilator waveforms and all the gases and everything on the other machine was like an iPad screen. And so I'm looking at all this stuff and I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. And, when we're talking in school about watching your end-tidal CO2 and your expired O2 and your expired SIVO and your expired nitrous, or, whatever the expired gas that you're measuring is, it's kind of hard to do that in simulation lab. At least it was for us, because we didn't have live patients. They weren't on actual gas. And so you didn't have number values pop up there. And so in the real world, whenever you're in the OR and you're looking at this digital screen, there's a lot of things on that digital screen. And granted, we covered all that stuff in CRNA school, but actually seeing it in practice and applying it was different than what we did in our simulation lab. And the equipment's going to be different. The anesthesia machine is really just one example. Really everything you use, or everything I used, was going to be different, except for like, your Mac and your Miller blade. Like, that's kind of standard, but you're going to have different video scopes. You may have a glide scope, you may have a McGrath, you may have, whatever other video scope you have. The LMAs that you use are going to be different. It's very different putting in an LMA on a mannequin versus a live human. It's very different intubating a mannequin than it is a live human. So all the equipment and things you use are going to be different when compared to what you use in your school. And that's not necessarily something you can prepare for, because you can't go, just pop in the OR and be like, oh, I'm just going to take a look around. But, you definitely have to have that in the back of your head, though, that, when I go to clinical, things are probably going to look different. And for us type A personalities, or even the people who are laid back, it's just different. We don't feel in control. When you go in and you see all of these things that you've learned about, but that just look different. And that's a thing that you'll definitely have to get used to. And even now at my second clinical site, the anesthesia machines are different than my first clinical site. And so I'm now on my second day at my second clinical site, and I'm like still trying to, make sure I know what's going on in the machine. Everything's the same. Like, you still have your ventilator, you still have your vaporizers and your gas, just some things are digital and some things are touch screen and some things twist knobs. And there's all kinds of just differences in those pieces of equipment that you have. And so that's something you have to take into consideration. Really everything down to, again, the like maybe the IV catheters that you're using are going to be different at your different clinical sites. So just know going in that you're going to have different equipment than what you're used to dealing with. And you have to just be willing to adapt. And that's part of being in CRNA school, right? You just have to adapt. Like, you have to adapt to what you're given. And, right when you're starting to feel comfortable for 12 weeks or however long your rotations are, right at the end, you're starting to feel great. Everything's good. You're comfortable. And then you're onto a new site and you're like, okay, back to square one. We're going to, we're going to climb the mountain a little quicker this time. So that's kind of where I'm at now. I feel like I was really good at week 12 at my first site. And now I'm like day 2 at my other site. And I'm like, okay, we're slowly getting back up there. And that's normal. That's very normal. But all of the equipment, all the things, again, anything from the machine to the ET tubes to the LMAs to the video scopes, they're all going to be different site to site. And especially from what you're training on in simulation lab. So just know that. And the way I would remedy that is on your first few days of clinical, show up early and grab one of the anesthesia techs or grab one of the CRNAs that maybe they're early and have them walk you through some of the stuff. Or you can do it yourself. Go into your OR, walk through, play around on the machine, get to know where your equipment is, look at the equipment if it's different than what you're used to. Just have a good idea of your equipment is really what it comes down to. And I mean, that's really anywhere you go. Even as a CRNA, like you need to have a good idea of your equipment, know your equipment. If you're not familiar with it, go in early and get familiar with it before you start having to have patients in the room and you're trying to take care of patients and you need something, you don't know where it is, and you kind of see how that can snowball. So that's my second point. The equipment is going to be different.
Hey, future CRNA, another daily dose of inspiration along your CRNA journey. In today's success story, we're going to share kind of an untraditional experience from one of our students. So the post reads, "I'm so excited to post I was accepted into CRNA school. I interviewed at my dream school. The meeting and panel showed me that this was really not the place for me. Although it was close to my home, the culture and I weren't a match. So after a bit of a traumatic interview experience, I was invited to interview at another school. Side note that I applied to 3 schools, waitlisted at 1. The negative feeling was mutual at my top choice. They accepted at the program that became one of her dreams. Anyway, I called and spoke with the director before the interview, and within minutes, I was excited beyond words. There was a warmth and character that resonated with me. I moved forward with the interview. A couple hours after the interview, they offered me a position in the cohort for the spring. Mind you, the application was for spring 2024, not 2023. So what an incredible surprise that I get to start my journey a year earlier. I don't think this would have been possible without CRNA School Prep Academy and my mock interview. Larissa was fantastic for the mock interview and helped me get over an unsettling experience from my former dream school. The podcast, lectures, resources, mock interview, all CSPA had to offer made this possible. Thank you so much. Don't give up. Don't be afraid to be untraditional in your career path. Study and believe in yourself. Things turn out the way they are meant to be." I just love this so much because while this student had an unfortunate experience at what they thought was their dream school, they turned it around. And they also were waitlisted at a school that didn't start till 2024. And when they got asked to interview at the 3rd school, they were so shaken up by their previous experience that they decided to call and talk directly to this program prior to even interviewing. Now, mind you, they had already knew they had a seat at a school, but didn't start till 2024. But after talking with this other program faculty, they knew they had to give themselves a chance to interview. They felt instantly connected to this program faculty, and they were so happy they did because they got in just a few hours after the interview, and they get to start CRNA school an entire year sooner. So I wanted to share this with you because I thought this was really inspirational. And it just goes to show that kind of what we have preached before in the show is that this is a two-way street. You are picking your programs and you may have your dream program in mind, but the reality is it may not be the right fit. And you may have to kind of improvise and pivot to a different school. And it may actually turn out to be the best decision for you ultimately is to not get into what you think is your dream school. So go into it with an open mind. I'm rooting for you. Thank you so much for sharing this story. Congratulations. You know who you are, and I'm always cheering you on.
My third point is this, and it's something that we probably all know, and that is all the personalities is how I have it titled, all the personalities. So all the personalities in CRNA School Clinical are going to be very different, and you're going to meet people who are super kind and want to teach you and want to help you. And you're going to meet people who maybe aren't so kind and who probably don't want to help you. And you just really have to be resilient with that is kind of what it comes down to, because you're going to meet both extremes. You're going to meet people who are, like I said, very nice and kind and loving and caring and, will put you under their wing and will take care of you. And then you're going to meet the extremes of that. And it doesn't mean they're bad people. They may just have different personalities. And so, as you probably surmise, there are very strong personalities in the anesthesia world, and the anesthesia world is very small. So, you're going to have to learn to navigate those personalities. And personally, I think that is one of the most challenging aspects of being in the clinical environment is navigating the personalities. And I'll give you some examples for my last clinical site. I knew based on who I was working with that day, after I'd been there, for a few weeks, I knew based on who I was working with, kind of how the day was going to go. I knew some people were super laid back. I could do within reason whatever I wanted to as far as my plan. I could, if we're doing general surgery, and normally for general surgeries, we would do gas and an ET tube, et cetera. And, if I wanted to play around and do a TIVA, intubate the patient and put them on the ventilator and then just run a TIVA, which is total IV anesthesia. I could do that. Or I could put them on gas and I could play around with a combination of any of that. And the preceptors, some of the preceptors I had were totally fine with that. If I wanted to experiment with new medications, if I wanted to try esmolol on induction one time, or if I wanted to play around with Presidex or ketamine, I could totally do that. And then there was the opposite extreme of those preceptors, and those were the preceptors who were like, no, like we're going to do it this way, and we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And they would take the initiative on, if the patient's hypotensive, they would get up and treat the blood pressure before I would have a chance to, if I'm charting. And so it's just different personalities, and again, that's just all going to come with people, really, and where you're at and what site you're at and what the culture is there, and it's just going to vary place to place, very wildly, place to place, very daily, actually, because sometimes you're changing preceptors daily. You'll start with somebody and you'll end up with somebody else, and it's just kind of getting in that routine of who you're working with. But the good thing is, if you're at a site for a long enough period of time, usually you get to know pretty much all the anesthesia providers there, and you get to know if they are nice, if they're helpful, if they're good. You get to know like who's going to let you do what after a little while. And that's kind of one of the challenging things about starting at a new site, is you don't know anybody. But then on the plus side, they don't know you either. And so some of the people you work with, like after you work with them, 6 or 12 weeks, you're competent, they're going to see that you're competent, and they'll start letting you do stuff. And if you take the initiative on wanting to experiment with things, they will let you do that. However, when you start at a new site, they don't know who you are and you don't know who they are. So they may be a little more on your back, watching you, trying to figure out, do you know what you're doing? Are you safe? And then when you start proving yourself, get a few cases in, a few days in, and you're doing everything right, and you're nailing your intubations, and you're keeping up with the case, you're running the case yourself, then they begin to trust you. And so that goes a long way as well. And so yeah, all the personalities are going to be different. It's going to vary site to site. And if you're in CRNA school, you will see this in your didactic phase as well, because all your professors are CRNAs or physician anesthesiologists, depends on where you go or what school you're at. But you're going to see those personalities in your professors now. Those same types of personalities are present in people who are not your professors at your school. You're going to have to navigate the personalities, because that is one of the most challenging aspects of being in clinical practice as a student, especially, or as a resident, is navigating those personalities. But I wish I had known that. I wish I had known how different those personalities were. But my word of advice to you is this: whenever you encounter those personalities, find a way to take something away from it. Because if they're having you try something different or do things this way, take something away from that. Because all the people that I've worked with at my first clinical rotation over 12 weeks, they all taught me their own ways of doing things, because it was my first rotation. The first few weeks, I had no idea what I was doing. And I'm watching them, and I'm doing some things myself, and I'm kind of gathering what I like and what I don't like. And I've built some of my habits around the people that I've worked with. And so that will be you as well. If you're applying to CRNA school, you're going to build your clinical habits around the people that are training you. And there are going to be some habits you're like, I don't really like that. That's not really for me. And there's some habits you're like, yeah, I think I'll pick up on that. Like, it's a really good idea. I know when I first started, one of the CRNAs was like, after you pushed your probe and you pushed your rock and you're just waiting, for the rock to set in, you can hit the pause alarm on your monitors and it counts down for 2 minutes. And that's roughly when your rock's going to set in. However, with time, you can feel, when you're bagging the patient, you can feel when the patient starts to loosen up, and when you're ready to take a look and to intubate the patient. But that comes with experience. Like, you're not going to know that feeling your very first few times doing an intubation or giving rock or whatever. So you're going to pick up on little clinical tips like that. So like I said, some things you're going to like and you want to take for yourself, and some things you're like, I may not try that, but it's good to know. And the thing is, you have to be open and willing to navigate those personalities, because there's some people who aren't going to be super nice, but you will still learn things from them. And there are people who are going to be very, very nice, and you're going to learn things from them too. So navigating the personalities, I could say a lot more about that, but we'll stop there. That is probably the hardest part. And the last point kind of ties into that, and that is anesthesia is different. Anesthesia is different depending on your location. Now, I will put the caveat like this: anesthesia is not that different. Okay, you're basically doing the same thing. There are, if you're in CRNA school, you know this. If you're a CRNA, you obviously know this. If you're looking to apply to CRNA school, you may not know this. There are like a million ways to do anesthesia. There are a million cocktails that you can come up with to do anesthesia. And the cool thing is, there are like a very small few of those cocktails that are wrong in the wrong patient population, but the majority of those cocktails are right for a lot of different people. You can do anesthesia a lot of different ways, and it doesn't make it right or wrong. And that's the cool thing, is you're going to go to one of your clinical sites one day and you're going to do anesthesia for, for your list, whatever, 5 or 6 patients that day. You're going to go with somebody else the next day and you may be doing the same kinds of cases, and they're going to do things completely different. And that's okay. That's where you pick up on, okay, I like that. Like that patient, that worked well for that patient. Like the patient woke up, was not in pain, no nausea, vomiting, like great. And then maybe you do a case with somebody else and you're like, oh, I don't necessarily like that. Like maybe the patient didn't like, or I say the patient didn't like it. Maybe the patient woke up and was hurting really bad. And you were like, well, maybe we could have done X, Y, and Z to better help with that. So all that to say, like the anesthesia that you're going to see is different. That's going to be different pretty much daily on when you're in one clinical site. You're going to work with different preceptors who are going to do things differently. But it's even more so true and even more magnified whenever you are jumping clinical sites to like across state lines, like I did my first clinical rotation in a separate state than I'm doing my second rotation in right now. And the anesthesia, while it's the same, or we're doing general anesthesia with gas, some of the multimodals we're using are different. Some of the adjuncts we're using are different. Some of the blocks we're doing are different. And it doesn't make it right or wrong. It's just different. And that's something you have to be ready for, because you're leaving one clinical site thinking, okay, I'm going to do it this way, this way, this way. And you get to your next clinical site and they're like, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this. And you're like, okay, maybe I haven't done that yet, but sure, we'll give it a try. And I'll give you like some practical examples. So at my first site, we rarely gave Versed pre-op. Like maybe in 12 weeks, I maybe gave it 3 or 4 times, like not common. And, obviously this is not just to the 80-year-olds, like we're not going to give Versed to the 80-year-olds, but even the 20 or 30, 40-year-olds, like we didn't give Versed. And is it right? Perhaps. Is it wrong? No. You don't have to do that. Now at my current clinical site, second day, pretty much everybody gets Versed. Like from what I've seen, everybody gets Versed. Like unless you're, everybody of appropriateness gets Versed. I'll put it that way. You're not giving 90-year-olds Versed, but everybody of appropriateness gets Versed there. And at this clinical site, it's very independent, meaning I can do pretty much what I want. As long as it's safe for the patient, I can do it. So I will say, like, I haven't been giving Versed. And some people were like, why aren't you giving Versed? And I'm like, I haven't. I don't have a good reason for it. Honestly, if the patient's anxious and, asks for something for their anxiety, like I will give it then. But I just don't go up and give Versed to everybody like some of the anesthesia providers do. Is it right or wrong? No. And then some other examples, like at my last clinical site, we did not use ketamine very much at all, because it came in 500 milligram vials. And unless you're doing like an 8-hour spine case, like you're probably never going to give 500 milligrams of ketamine. That's a lot of ketamine. However, at this clinical site, we have syringes of 50 milligrams, which is much more conducive to everyday use. And so we do use a lot of ketamine in cases at the facility where I'm at now. And so is it right or is it wrong? No, it's just different. And take any number of things and you will see that pattern. It's going to be different no matter where you go. I'm picking up things that I didn't get at my last clinical site. I'm getting to experiment a little bit with other drugs, and that's cool. Getting to do more blocks. The other place that I left we didn't do much regional anesthesia there. And so it's interesting seeing how anesthesia is different based on where you're at. And so again, I'm going to tie this back into the first point, which is I said, know where your sites are and know what kind of practice environment you're in. This really ties into that, because you really want to be at a site where you're going to be able to, or you want to be at multiple sites where you're going to be able to see different things. And that may be a downside to going to an academic medical center where you're only learning one way. You're seeing everybody do it in that culture that way. It's not right. It's not wrong. But it's different. Whereas if you're going over multiple states or multiple different clinical sites, you're seeing different patterns. You're seeing people do different things. And I think that is a really cool part of traveling for clinical, is you get to see anesthesia in different parts of the United States. And so that's one of the cool things now, is I'm seeing things that maybe I didn't see at my first clinical site. And it's just, again, not right or wrong. It's gray. It is what it is. It's safe for the patient, therefore it's right. But if I didn't do it that way, it doesn't make it wrong. And so, it's anesthesia is going to be different no matter where you go, no matter what area you practice in. You're going to see different trends. So those are the points that I have for you. All right. Number 1 was know your school and know your sites. Number 2, all the equipment you use is different. Number 3, know all the personalities. And number 4, anesthesia is going to be different no matter where you go. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. If this is something you found of interest, comment below. Let us know what you think. If you have tips or suggestions for content that you would like to see in the future, specifically from me as a guest host, comment below. Let us know. I would love to answer your questions or provide you with content that you might find beneficial. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.
Hey, future CRNA, as always, I appreciate you and your loyalty. Thank you so very much for tuning in this week. I'd love to hear from you, so screenshot this episode and share it to your IG stories with your biggest takeaway. Don't forget to tag me at CRNA School Prep Academy so I can personally thank you. Be sure to head over to CRNASchoolPrepAcademy.com to check out our blog and gather free resources to help you along your CRNA journey. Stay strong, and I'll see you next week.